Hey everyone, welcome back to Full Stack Development with Ember and Rails. I'm glad to be back again this week. I am Josh Justice, aka Coding It Wrong, and I'm excited to dig into this app more with you. If you're live on the stream, as always, I'd love for you to say hello. I love questions, I love chatting with folks as we go, feedback, ideas, and certainly if you're an Ember expert, you are better than me at it, and so I want to hear how I can do things better. And if you're watching the recording, then leave a comment or hit me up on Twitter at Coding It Wrong, because I want to hear how things are for you and trying out Ember and Rails and what you think. So today in the app, we're going to move forward with our Ember Rails application. We're going to get into a richer data model. But before we jump into that, I have a follow-up from last time where in vain I tried to figure out responsive layout with Ember Paper on the stream. It's not Ember Paper's fault, it's just responsive layout is complicated. But I figured it out and I'm going to drop it in while we go together here. So if you pull up Ember Paper's website, if you go under Layout and Introduction, you'll see information about these different attributes like flex, the flex width, the relative width of elements, and whether they should show or hide. And then you could kind of change how these work at different breakpoints. And so I'm going to not refigure this out, but I'm going to look at the code that I wrote last time, and we're going to drop it in and see it in action before we dive into our data model things. So if you see the application right now, here's our app, and as we drag the width of it, these elements just take up the whole width. Oh, and you can see me on Twitch in the background there as I drag it. Good times. Cool. So it's always there. Let's put this in. We'll put in our little developer tools so that we're not showing all my business in the background there. So as we drag the width, it's always full width, and that just doesn't look great on here, and it looks even worse on my full-size monitor that I'm not streaming. So let's see what we can do about this. Let's pull up the code for our application. We've got some notes there we're going to get into in a little bit. But in our Ember application, this is our application template, which is going to display the whole app. We have the app header, and then we have the outlet here, the place that the content of the route that we're on is going to be put. So we can put a few elements around this to kind of size it. We'll keep the app header how it is, fill out the whole width. We'll put a div here, and we'll give it class layout row. Incidentally, as I'm doing more of a React project right now, one of the nice things about Ember templates is the fact that the class attribute is just the class attribute. You don't need to remember a different name for use in JSX. You just write out your HTML as usual. So that's pretty nice. So we have a layout row here, and then what do we want to do? Really what we want conceptually is we want, instead of having this be the full width, we want an area on the left and an area on the right that are empty and are potentially small, and then the bigger area in the middle where our content is. So let's just add those divs. I'm sure there's better elements than divs, but divs is what I got for right now, so leave a note in the comments with what semantic markup I should be using instead. All right, so we got our 3 divs there, and now what we need to do is to size these differently at different purposes. And with Ember Paper, as is often the case with responsive design, you want to style your app for the small viewport, so mobile first, and then you add on styles that say, oh, if the view gets bigger, then we can change things up. So what we want to say here is the left and right divs, we're going to hide them by default. So let's say hide, and then here we say class equals flex 100. So we want it to be full 100% width by default unless we say otherwise. So let's save this. Probably our app is going to look just the same, and let's reload it and see. And sure enough, it displays just the same at any width. So that's cool. So now let's talk about what we can do at bigger breakpoint sizes. So let's say, I think there's maybe a small, it might be an extra small. Looks like there's an extra small and a small width. So what we want to do is to say, keep this in front of me. For the left and right, we want to show them if it's greater than small. So at size medium or up, we want to show the left and right space, but we want to hide it at small or lower. And so what's the width we want there? The width would be, let's start out, I'm about to sneeze. So the width we want, so we'll gradually bump up the percentage of the width that the left and right side are. So we'll say when they're shown, by default, it's going to be a flex percentage width of 10. So that would mean at the side, when you're greater than small, we want this to only be flex 80. So we say flex medium 80. And actually we could say greater than small 80. Let's do that for now, and we'll see if I regret live coding this and figuring this out. All right, so close some client work down there. All right, this can be a little bit wider. Cool, there we go. All right, so check this out. So when we have a small width that's up to this width, then we still have our body content being 100% of the width. But then as we get bigger, once we get bigger than that, now we have that left and right at 10% of the size. And so that makes the content a little bit smaller to kind of fit in there a bit nicer. Now we could take this any number of different levels, but let's just take it up one more level. We'll say, so for the sidebar, so if it's flex greater than medium, we'll do 20% instead of 10% width. And so what this means is that this 80% would just be for medium, and then we'll say flex for greater than medium is 60. So at size large or above, it's going to be 20% width on either side and 60% in the middle. So let's try that out, and let's see if my monitor is wide enough to show this. Oh, there we go. It just bumps out to it. So here, where we're at the large size, we have 20% on each side and 60% in the middle. And so that kind of gives these still a kind of a card effect. And then as we bump down, it kind of gets wider and wider until it's taken up the full width, and that's what would show up on mobile for us. So that's a cool responsive layout. Like, this feels nice. And as I was saying last time, the point of this is not that we need these visuals to spec it out, but just as I'm trying to subjectively feel out this app, and if I'm interested, if I'm motivated to use it, this gives it more of a professional feel, just a feel like it's a really substantial app. This is something I could play around with on my devices and get a feel for. So I really like that. So let's commit these changes. We'll make a new branch. We'll just call it data model, even though this commit is not related to that. Add responsive layout. And we're good. Cool. All right. So now we need to talk about our data model. And so up until this point, I think we just have the one model type. Let's see. Yeah, we just have the idea record. So all we have right now is just this one flat list of idea records. So that's pretty straightforward. But what I found, and as I said last time, is we're getting to the point where I'm not really able to explore the idea of this very well without getting into something richer. And so I want to flesh out the data model a little bit. And I was just kind of thinking through this. And as I thought about how I could illustrate it for y'all who are watching to understand what I was thinking, I realized that I could just draw out a diagram like I do in more complicated systems anyways. So I'm going to use OmniGraffle. It's a really cool app for the Mac. Love it a lot. Their icon's not showing up, so that's interesting. That part's not the most precise, but that's okay. So I'm just in the drawing app here, and it's a really effective way to make diagrams and rearrange them. So let's add the idea model that we have. We're still going to have that. This is an ideas app, so tracking ideas is a big part of what we want to do. So where do these come from? The reason I wanted to have separate models is that you could actually have multiple different quotes that all reference the same idea. And so this is often something that I'm doing when I'm trying to write a talk or share something or just have something for my own notes. I want to see multiple people that have talked about the same idea so I can kind of compare and contrast their thoughts on it. And so really the point here is that an idea has multiple quotes, and each quote, well, for right now, let's say each quote only relates to one idea. We could change that in the future if we found we needed something more complex. I'm using a very, very light version of Unified Modeling Language, which is a potentially very complicated diagramming setup, but really it's just the idea here that this arrow is a one-to-many relationship. So each quote has one idea, so there's an arrow because you can get from the quote to the idea, but an idea has multiple quotes, potentially multiple quotes that refer to it. So that's the direction the arrow goes. Maybe the error as well. So what does a quote come from? A quote comes from, I've been calling it a source up until this point. We may change that name at some point. I mean, it's going to be books or talks or articles, blog posts. But from the standpoint of like, if we're thinking about the app in terms of ideas, these are sources that the quotes come from. And a source can have multiple quotes, but a quote is just from one source. And a source can have an author. I'm going to put author in here. And because I have a lot of authors that I go to in multiple different ways, let's say we're going to have author as a separate record, so that way if I have multiple sources for an author, we're going to be able to track that. And so I didn't comp out or draw out what these screens are going to look like, but some of the main flows that I'm thinking of for the app are going to work like this. So you could say when I'm reading through a source or watching a talk or something like that, I'm probably looking at a page for the source and I'm probably entering multiple quotes as I go. So I see the quotes and I add more and more. And so this is kind of similar in this way to the way that we're used to taking notes in just a notes document where we're taking notes on a talk or a book, and we just write them one after the other. But the point and the value of the richness of this data model is we can go the other direction as well. We can go look at ideas that are kind of cross-cutting ideas that come from multiple sources, and we can see what are the quotes that come from that idea. So one of the nice things about this data model for illustrating Ember Data and the things we're getting into is that it's not a tree structure. It's like a multi-directional thing. It's a relational structure. And so we're going to be able to show the benefits of using a relational database, JSON API, which is an API format that we've been using so far that's really structured to handle relational data, and Ember Data, which is great at relational data as well. So we're going to get to see the strengths of this approach. So if you've come up and mostly worked in NoSQL databases, then this may be new to you, and you'll get to see some of the benefits of this relational approach. And we're going to walk through, in some level of depth, the different resources related to it. So with this, let's get started. Let's code this out in our app, and we're going to start building this out in Rails and then kind of build it forward into Ember, and we'll see how far we get today. And I've got a few examples of quotes and ideas and sources that we'll put in there once we get it into Rails. So I'll open this up in our Rails console over here, just because we could have more space that way. Is this gonna, if I resize it? Oh, it's not very resizable. Okay, let's open a new terminal actually, because that way I'm going to be able to make this as big as possible. We'll keep our other terminal over on the side, but this way we can just zoom that font in, and we got lots of space. Cool. So we're going to go into Apps, Ideas, API. We're now in our Rails app. What happened to our branch? Oh, we need a branch for the API as well. So this is one of the aspects of having two separate projects that make things a bit more complex. If you're working in the front end and the back end at the same time, that's two different repos you need to create branches on. So if you have separate teams working on those, that works out better a lot of the time. If it's the same person, the same team, it can be a bit more challenging. It's not going to be a big problem, but that may be a reason you may find that you want to keep your front end and back end in the same repo. But that would make it harder to deploy to Heroku and Netlify separately. So anyways, that's the thing about branches. So we've got our data model branch here, and so let's think about what we have. We have currently an idea model, and in Rails we can look at this schema file that shows the generated schema of the database. So our model files just kind of infer the database table, so there's nothing really in there. But in our schema file, we could see that an idea has a summary and a quote. So this quote field is actually going to need to go because we're going to need to put it into another table. So let's add one at a time here. I think it's going to be easiest if we go through and add the author first, because the author doesn't have references to other things. It'll be pretty straightforward regardless. So let's just do it. As you may remember, we can have a Rails generate command, or Rails G model, and we're going to call this author. So what does an author have? I mean, you know, I was about to do a first name and last name, but I've heard these articles recommending that depending on the culture people are from, that first and last name doesn't necessarily break down. And there's no real reason that I need to have somebody's last name. So let's try to be multicultural, and let's just have a single name field. That'll be nice and simple. Why not? Okay, so author has a name. I suppose we could add other things like their Twitter account and stuff like that. But part of the deal with this agile approach is not overthinking those things and just adding what we need for right now. So an author really just needs a name to start out. Is string the right data type? I think string is the right data type. Those are listed in the Rails reference docs, and you can see which fields you can hit there. I'm going to check on my that stream capturing things is making things run a little slow. We're trying to generate this model. I wonder if it's because... Oh, there we go. Okay, and so we see that the migration file has been created, the model file, and then a test file that we're actually not going to use. So if we look, our schema file, is not yet updated because we're going to need to run that migration. But if we see the migration file, we can see that we're creating a table authors that just has a name and it has timestamps on it. So that's nice and straightforward. Let's come back to, before we run that database migration, let's go ahead and create some new things. So we have our author. Next, we need a source. So let's do Rails G model source, and it's going to have probably a title. Title versus, I mean, a person has a name clearly. Source title is usually good, but that's often whenever I'm creating things. Name versus title can be hard to choose what I name that field. But a source has a title, so that's straightforward. I am going to have a URL because whether it's the URL of the thing itself, like a blog post, or a canonical URL to like buy it from or find out about it, these things have URLs. And so I think having a URL for a source is going to be really nice. Probably will have a type in the future, like is it a video, is it a book, or whatever. But for now, title and URL I think is probably fine. But then the other thing is we can go ahead and set up a foreign key relationship, and we'll say author references. So this is kind of interesting because it's not the author that references something, it's the source that references author. This is just a Rails convention, but what it means is the model is going to have a has-one relationship or a belongs-to relationship the source is going to have a belongs-to relationship to the author. So we run this, and then we're going to do a little bit more work to wire that up afterwards. And this, on the video, we're not going to get into the basics of SQL relational database design. I'm not actually sure of a great resource for learning that, so that would be a good thing for me to find out about, to teach folks about that, to have something to share. So I'll try to look into that and let folks know. So now to create sources, we have a title URL, and then we see that the sources references author, and we use a foreign key, which is a database constraint to make sure we don't delete an author but leave their source hanging. So that connection is going to work. And let's go ahead and set up the Rails database relationship as well. So what we can do is this. Let me find this in the document here. So in the Rails guides, there's a number of sections about active record, just because your data layer is rich and robust and there's a lot there. And active record associations is what we want to use to learn about when tables are connected to one another in a relational way. And so you can see on the sidebar here, there's a belongs to, has one, has many associations, and others like that. So you can learn about those there. Hopefully, probably we'll just need the basics right here. So, well, let me do this first. I'm going to run the database migration to show that this is here. So let's say Rails db migrate, and that's going to actually connect to our development database and run these migrations to create the database tables or add columns and fields and indexes as we need it. So we see that those have run, and now we can look in the schema file, and we can see that now there's an authors table. The ideas table is still there. There's some OAuth stuff that was already there, and now we have sources as well. And then notice here, we have a big int author ID. So this is an ID field pointing to the author table. And we have an index, a database index called index sources on author ID. That's down here. That says that it's a foreign key to, again, make sure those two are talking together in the right way. So our database is now all set up, but now we can make changes, and we need to make changes to our models here to indicate the relationship between these two. Oh, I see here, actually this is interesting, I have not noticed this before, that in the source we already have the belongs to macro that's been run here to say that a source belongs to an author, and that's going to let us navigate that relationship. Now from the author here, we can say has many sources, and this just lets you say you can get an array or a list of all the sources that an author has. Now, you don't have to define both of these relationships if you don't want to navigate in both different directions, but one of the things that I mentioned in thinking about our app is that going multi-directionally in this data model is going to be useful. So far, that's what I'm sticking with, to kind of go that direction. Okay, so we've got our application and our source, and so let's go ahead and generate another model. And in other projects, I might create one model at a time and like build up the user interface and stuff like that. But in this experimental phase for this project, I found that I really want to work with all of these together so I can play with how these models work and how we're going to display them. So we also had a quote as a separate field. So generate a model. It's a quote. And it's going to have, well, geez, what are we going to say? It's going to reference as a source. But then what do you call the quote? Like the quote has a quote field? I guess it's the text of the quote. And we're going to do a text field. So if you haven't worked in relational databases, I'll say this a brief way. There's some text fields that are string fields for textual data that are intended to represent small amounts of text, like kind of effectively like a one-line string. There's other ones that are made to store arbitrarily large amounts of text, and there's differences to how those are implemented. So a quote could be fairly long, and so we want to use this field called text to store that. And again, I'm not walking through all the different types of field types, but you can check the Rails documentation to see those. Okay, so a quote is from a source, and it has text in it. So we're going to generate that, and that's good. We'll go ahead and run Rails db migrate to get that in there, and then we'll see how that is set up and laid out. Here, Let's run the page. And quotes. A quote has a text of text, and then it has a source. So now we can go into here. The quote belongs to a source, and a source belongs to an author and has many quotes. I think you pluralize there. Cool, so then the last change we need to do is, when we set things up before, and I sort of saw this coming, in the ideas field, we had quote as just a text field inside ideas itself. So we want to get rid of that. We want to make a change. And so now we want to do another migration that's going to get rid of this quote field on here. And then, let me actually just think about if I've done something wrong. So we have our quote here. Quote belongs to a source, and the quote also points to one idea. So actually, I've missed a field. I want quotes to have an idea ID as well as a source ID. And so you might think I planned this, but I did not. But I'm going to show something nice here. So we can undo our migration. So I could add a new migration to add this column in. But because we just ran this, I can undo what I did and make a change to it. So you can do Rails DB rollback to undo the last migration. And this is often happens as you're working in an agile way. You create a table, you try it out, you find before you've even committed the code that you need to make a change, and so you can roll it back. And then you can go and Rails D, if you change G to D for delete, it's just going to delete all the files that it generated. And so this is really nice to actually get a nice clean starting point to start over. Then I can go back to my generate command, and I can add it in. So I can say idea references. So that was the column that we were missing. So a quote has a text, and a quote is from one source, and a quote illustrates one idea. So this should give us what we want now. Rails DB migrate. Run that. And now looking in our schema, we see here that a quote has a source and an idea. And up here, we see a quote belongs to a source, belongs to an idea. And then idea has many quotes. So now just as a separate migration, we just need to get rid of the quote text column on ideas, because that's duplicating data that we now have living on a whole table to represent this one-to-many relationship. So Rails G. So if you just want to do a migration that's just making some database changes, that's not creating a new model, you do Rails G or generate migration, and you give the migration a name. And usually we say, talk about add or removing or changing. Say remove quote from ideas. And sometimes Rails can infer things automatically from the migration name. So let's see what it infers. I can never keep it straight. So in remove quote from ideas, okay, no, it's not added anything in. Okay, so there's a command here to remove from the column, remove a column from here. I'm going to just check my reference. So there's a great reference app, if I haven't referred to it before, called DevDocs. And it just lets you have references to all the different kind of languages and frameworks you use frequently on the side here. So I can just say Rails, and now I can search for something in here. And something about remove column, and I just search by name, and it comes up here under schema statements, and then it pulls up the doc. Okay, this is kind of a weird way of phrasing it, but here we go. Remove column, table name, column name, and type if you want to. So remove column. So this is removing from ideas. Quote, is that the name of the column? Yeah. And so you might say, okay, well, I'm removing ideas and quote. Like, why would I need the type field? Why would that be useful? And I'll show you why. But first, I'm going to go to create ideas. Yeah, it's just text. Let's run the migration, and then we'll see why you might want to specify that column type. All right, so it's run, and we can check our schema and see that the quote field is there. So one of the deals with Rails migrations is that they're reversible. So you saw that I did a Rails DB rollback earlier to delete a table that I created, and that's easy to undo, because if you created a table, you want to undo it, you just delete it. In the case of removing a column, though, Rails just sets up and tries to make these things reversible for you as much as it can, but in order to reverse removing a column, that's adding a column back in. So Rails needs the information here in this file that's been recorded, what column type to add it back in. So if I do Rails DB rollback now, that information about the fact that we removed a text column means that Rails is able to add a text column as well, and now it's back in there. Yeah, quote. Cool. And then let's go just Rails DB migrate again. So yeah, having your columns be reversible is really useful, especially when you're working on other projects with other users or when you're deploying to multiple different environments. So, okay, I think we've got our data models all set up now. Let's take a look at the relationships and our model classes to see if they're set, and then we'll get into the Rails console to play with them. So an author has many sources. A source belongs to one author and has many quotes. A quote belongs to a source and to an idea. And then an idea has many quotes. So I think that's all the connections we need. And our database has been migrated. So let's now go into the Rails console and let's set some of these up. I wrote up another sample quote that we can use as well. Okay, so in the Rails console, you can use the Rails model classes directly. I showed that on a previous stream. So let's just kind of get into it. So we have author all, and this returns 0 authors. So let's do author.create. Now, when you're working through a console, it's a good idea to use the bang version of the create method, adding in the exclamation point, which is just part of the method name. Ruby allows you to have exclamation points or question marks as the last character of a method name. And this is going to throw an exception if there's an error creating this record, and that's the most useful in tests and in the console. Sometimes when I don't remember the fields on a table, I'll just run create without passing any parameters to see what the fields that it tells me are needed. So if I run author create, it actually works because it's not required. So that's funny. That's very funny indeed. Do I want to go ahead and require these columns now? In my past, I had added in lots and lots of data validations. I've noticed in the Rails world, we don't do that quite as often. But I think requiredness for fields is useful, especially when you have an empty name. I mean, that just might display incorrectly in a list. So let's delete that last record. In the Rails console, underscore refers to the last value that was returned. So you can just assign that to a value. And then let's say author, probably delete. Yep, that deletes it. And then author.all. There we go. So that's there. Okay, so I'm going to quit removing it. I'll require that. So in Rails, you use this macro called validates. And then you give the name of the field, name. And you say it validates the presence. So instead of saying it's required, in Rails you say, what are you validating? You're validating the presence of this field. So validates presence true. And let me just make sure I'm remembering this correctly. Let's open up the Rails console again, and let's try again to create an author and make sure the validation error will error out. Again, you'd think that I was illustrating this, but this is all just stuff that happens. So yeah, that didn't work, did it? Inserting into authors. That failed. Okay. All right, so let's look up the Rails validations and see what I'm remembering incorrectly here. Validates name, presence true. Oh, it's in the idea. That was the problem. Okay. Author. There we go. I think we can do author.destroyAll. I actually forget in the Rails console that you can use tab to complete, but just right now on the stream I'm remembering that, so that's pretty nice. So I want to destroy all authors. Death of the author or something like that. So now all authors are gone. So now let's do author create. Here we go. Validation failed, name can't be blank. So that's great. So you'll notice that we didn't make a change to the database to make that a not null column. Maybe we'll come back and do that later, but right now we're sticking with experimentation. But I do at least want these validations in, because as you can see, I can create things without the proper fields. So we'll put in Sandy Metz, one of my favorite authors and the one that I had the quote from previously. So there's Sandy. We'll assign her to a variable called Sandy because we're going to use that for setting up relationships. So one of the other nice things about Rails is that when you have these relationships on records, you can operate off of the collection of them. So I could say source.create, and pass in some stuff, including the author is Sandy. But there's actually another way to do it. I could say Sandy.sources. Let's query that. So that says 0. And I can just call create on sources. Actually, let me put those validations in before I do that, though, so I don't have more bad records. We'll copy this. We'll look at the schema to see that source has a title and a URL. Let's allow the URL to be nullable. And I'm not sure if the author ID. I think foreign keys in recent versions of Rails are required by default, so we probably don't need to put anything on that. But we'll make the title required on the source. Validates title, presence true. And then for a quote, I mean, we definitely need the text for a quote, because like that's the whole deal. Validates the text of the quote, presence true. And then for the idea, what did I call that? I call it the summary. That's fine. Summary, presence true. Okay. I think I may need to run this reload command in the Rails console to reload the latest version of the code. So now we've got, do I still have Sandy? I do. So I can say Sandy sources create. And that did not get that required field. Dang it. What have I done wrong? Source validates title presence true. I wonder if the reload was not good enough. So let's quit. Let's source destroy all. Let's quit. Let's reopen. We are learning things together here today. This is great. All right. Oh, we need to find Sandy. Sandy equals author first. And Rails is just so nice. You can say author.first and you got your record. You're good to go. There we go. Okay, so reload was not good enough. Apparently I needed to do quit and re-enter the console. I'm sure there's another way to do it, but okay, title can't be blank, so I'll add the title. Practical object oriented design. And I forget if she hyphenates it there, so let's check and see. Practical object oriented design. Previously in Ruby, and now just titled practical object oriented design. It's hyphenated, and since we're here, we might as well just add the URL in. So let's save that. And again, we're not passing the author here because the fact that we're creating this record on the sources association means that we know the author. The author's Sandy. And so we can see there that in this record created, we have the author ID field, which is the author ID 3. Cool. So from here, let's call this pood. Pooder, previously called that. From here, we can say pood.author is Sandy, and we can say sandy.sources, and pood shows up in the list, in the array. So this is the bidirectional nature of these relationships, which is going to be really useful as we start building out our user interface. All right, so now we need a new quote. So we have pood.quotes is empty, create, and I really hope I got the validation in this time. Let's see. We're good. Okay, we got a validation failure. Great. Oh, interesting. So check this out. Idea must exist and the text can't be blank. So that's interesting. We don't want quotes in the system right now unless there's an idea that they relate to. So I think that's fine for now. We may regret that later, depending on how things get created in the front end. But let's work with that. So let's create the idea. Actually, I think we have an idea. The reason software design is necessary is because change is inevitable. It's so deep. This is the idea we created the previous time, and when we dropped that quote column, it was removed, but this record was still here. Now, we would have lost that data if we didn't have it somewhere else, but I do have it somewhere else, so that's no problem. So I don't really know what variable name to give this idea, so I'll just call it idea. And that's there. So now let's go back to pood quotes create idea, and then we'll say the text of the quote is, and let's copy and paste it. Kind of a long one here. Paste it in, and we're good. We see that it's pointing to a source ID and an idea ID, and now these are all connected together. So we've got one record of each type, so that's really great. Now, while we're at it, I am thinking about these things a lot, so let's add a few more records just so we can see them as we're working around. So let's want another author. His name is Martin Fowler. I was looking in his book recently. Let's create it. The title is Refactoring. we'll just create that. Yeah, there we go. Factoring is there. And then, so we want to create a new idea. And the way this works, because the quote requires an idea to already exist, we're going to kind of need to create this standalone idea. Let's just make sure that validation works as well. Summary can't be blank. So let's paste in the summary here. I was thinking about the idea of refactoring in small steps. So here's an idea. Refactoring in small steps allows you to make changes gradually. Cool. So here's this idea. Let's call it our idea. Letter R idea. So now let's go back to refactoring quotes create idea. And actually, let's go around the other way. We can say idea. So our idea quotes create. Let's create the quote from this side this time. And we'll say the summary of the idea. Wait, no, this is the quote. So the text of the quote is this. Copy and paste it. I have 2 quotes for this book, so this is actually going to be nice that we can illustrate that. So here's a paragraph. You can read it on your own afterwards. Of course. Source must exist. So because I'm creating this on the quotes relation, the source from the other side is what I need to pass it in. And the source is refactored. So that's fine. And then now we'll just create one more our idea. And actually, let's create this other quote one last way. So we can create a quote directory on the quote model. And it's going to say source, idea, and text must all be there. So if we're creating a standalone quote, we pass in the source, refactoring, and pass in the idea, our idea, and the text is this. So that's just a few different ways to create the data based on where you are. And this can be really useful in the application code based on what information you already have or don't. So now we're all set. So this quote has now been added as well on this idea. So now, let me just, through the console, visualize what I was describing before. We could see the list of all the ideas, and we have kind of our nonsense ideas there. And then, so here's idea 6. So we could say our idea equals idea find by ID 6. So here's our idea. Refactoring in small steps allows you to make changes gradually. So our idea.quotes. And then I can see 2 different quotes about this idea. And from there, I can trace them back to the source that they came from and then to the author. So that's going to allow us to display that nicely in the user interface. Or I can go the other way, and I can say for the refactoring book, and get the refactoring book, and then I can say, what are the quotes from that? And then I can get the list of quotes in the book. So those are the 2 different directions we could look at this relational information. All right, so I think this is all we need to do in the terminal for right now. Let's commit our information. So one note is Rails will generate these test files for the models with nothing in them yet, but just ready to go. I do love testing, and I would definitely flesh out tests for a production application, but I don't always test at the model level here because when models just contain simple fields, it's not necessarily that useful to test at that level. So these tests I'm actually just going to delete for now. And maybe we'll add them back into the future. All right, so added files here, we have a few database migrations, the updated schema file, and then the model files that will correspond to them. Add richer data model is what we're going to say. So now it's time to do what's next. What's next is to go to JSON API. JSON API, again, or JSON API resources being the gem, the library that we're using to be able to expose this information in API format. So we walked through this briefly before, but let's take a look at it. We have, and now I'll keep the terminal over on the right-hand side here. No, I'm confused. What am I going to do? Yeah, I'll keep the terminal on the right-hand side. All right, so we have all these different models, including, but then under resources, we only have an idea of resource. So the idea of resources, to repeat what we said a few sessions ago, is that this contains the logic of what data is exposed to the end user from our models. So we need to generate these now. So we'll say Rails G, JSON API, resource, author. Let's just generate one, and then we'll go from there. Oh, this is the Ember application. That's right. So when I go out into the API, and now we'll rerun that. Generate the API resource. And I don't think you really pass in parameters to that generator. I think you modify that in the file itself. So here's our author resource ready to be configured. Looking at the idea resource, we see that there was attributes added to it. So we'll go ahead and remove that quote attribute that's no longer on the idea resource, and we'll add a name attribute on the author resource. This will allow this attribute to be accessed through the API versus just being data that's stored privately on the back end but not exposed publicly. All right, we need to check in here to set up. Well, let's create the other resources with their basic fields, and then we'll set up the relationships. So we want to create a source resource. Hopefully that won't bite us in the butt later. And we're going to create a quote resource. Let's add them all in. A source has a title and a URL, and a quote has a text. Now, how do we get these to relate together? I could have done research in advance to remember how to do this, but I'm going to show you the documentation instead to do better tutorials, so you're welcome. And also, I'm lazy. So we can check under JSON API Resources Documentation, the Resources section here, Relationships. And so we see here, there's a relationship macro we can use. We can also just use has one and has many. And so this is interesting. In JSON API Resources, there's not the concept of belongs to, just the concept of has one. Active Record has a separate concept of, here we go, associations. A separate concept of belongs to and has one. In both cases, it's a record pointing back to one, but there's differences as far as like conceptually, as well as whether data is like automatically persisted to be deleted when it's deleted out. But that doesn't pertain as much to JSON API, so it just uses has one. But that's really nice that it's pretty parallel to the macros that we use in Active Record itself. And again, just because there's this relationship in the back end doesn't mean we necessarily want to expose it to the front end, but in our case we do. So we want to say an author has many, I assume plural, right? Yeah, plural. Author has many sources. A source has one author, has many, what is it? Quotes. And then a quote has one source, has one idea, and then an idea has many quotes. And in case has many is confusing, like many could be 0, could be 1, or it could be multiple. So has many just means it's not limited to one. It's an array, it's a list. Okay, so we've wired together these relationships. I think that should make sense. We'll play around with it in Postman to kind of get access to it after this and see how it goes. But we do need to generate controllers. So controllers are the layer that actually connects with HTTP, and most of what we need in the controller, JSON API gives to us. So that's going to be nice and easy. So I'm going to, in this case, I'm going to actually create them by hand. And the reason why is because we're going to want to change something here. So notice here, for ideas controller, we inherit from JSON API resource controller. This is sort of a scoping operator to show that we're pulling this in from JSON API itself. But we added in this one piece of functionality. We skipped the before action to verify authenticity token, because that's a security feature for server-rendered Rails apps that's not needed for an API. We're actually going to need to do this for all of our endpoints here. And so what I'm going to do instead is to put this in a shared parent controller. You don't want to do doing too much inheritance is not a good idea, but this much is useful. So Rails provides us with this application controller, and in the application template that I set up, there's a number of things already set up here. So I'm inheriting from JSON API resource controller, just like the generated controllers do. I'm skipping the before action verify authenticity token, and I'm also providing this information on the context and the current user, which we'll get into a bit in a future session when we start talking about authentication. But we can ignore this for now. But the key is application controller is going to give us this disabling of verify authenticity token, as well as some other shared concerns. So the net result is for ideas controller, we want to inherit from application controller. And then we don't actually need any implementation body itself. And so now we can just create the same thing. We can create an authors controller. We can create a sources. BR. That is incorrect. RB, and we can create a quotes controller, RB. And we're just going to copy and paste because it's pretty simple. Authors controller, quotes controller, and sources controller. The final step, if I'm remembering correctly, that we need to do is to add in routes for these controllers. So in our routes file, we see that we have JSON API resources ideas. And so we're going to be able to do a significant amount of other stuff as well. We just say JSON API resources for authors, ideas, quotes, sources, QRS. That's alphabetical, right? Other than I'm separating out users just because it's kind of separate and different. And we don't need this welcome page, but I'll come back and delete that shortly. So this adds in all of our routes, and we should be good to go. So I think our app is running. It's probably okay. We probably don't need to stop the app from running or anything like that. So that's probably fine. So I think our app is ready. Let's start to explore it through Postman. And while Postman is starting, we'll look at the routes. You can type Rails routes to see all the routes available to your application. So let's see what JSON API resources is made available to us. So there's quite a few, just from those few lines. So down here, we have authors, and if your brain can parse this, let's see if I can get rid of the line breaks. Yeah, that's kind of hard. It's a little bit hard just because of how wide it gets. But if you just look at the center column here, you can see we can get authors to get a list of them. We can post to authors to create them. We can get author's ID to get an author by ID. And then check this out. Under, not that. Authors, yeah, here we go. So under authors, author ID, relationships, we can show the sources for an author. Or we can just go directly to author ID sources to get the list of them. And then if we go down to sources, by contrast, we can go from sources to go back to the quotes for it. And you can also go to get the single author that a source belongs to. So this bidirectional relationship, all these different endpoints that JSON API is making available to us, we're able to navigate in the different directions. So let's give that a try using Postman. And I'll try to zoom in a bit here to make a little bit of space available. We still have my setup here from last time. Okay, so let's start at authors again. We're just connecting to localhost 3000 authors. Let's see if I can hide in the sidebar. Toggle sidebar. There we go. All right, so we request the authors, and then we see a list here. Let me hide the params here as well. Can I do that? Oh, there we go. Okay, so we get, when we do a get request to authors, we get an array back here with Sandy Metz and Martin Fowler. And now you can see a bit more than in the past what these links are for. So you have a self link that's going to take you just to the one record for this one author. You also have a link to related records here. So we can say authors 3 sources to get the sources for that author. So if we just go to /sources, we can get the list of all of them, POOD and refactoring there. But if we go back to authors, so you say authors 4 sources. And actually, let's do this. Authors 4 is Martin Fowler, and then we still have that link to authors 4/sources to get the sources belonging to Martin Fowler. That's refactoring. And so now we can say sources 3 author will give us Martin Fowler again, and sources 3 quotes is going to give us the 2 quotes that come from this thing, from this source. So we're able to navigate around. And the idea of these links is one of the big goals of JSON API is discoverability. The idea is that you don't need to know everything about the API when you first hit it to know what requests to make, but that as you're looking at the responses you get back, you can navigate around. I think the concept is called HATOAs. It's a really interesting concept. Let's search for it and see. HATOAs, hypermedia as the engine of application state. And Hatios or HATOAs. I like Hatios as well because it sounds like cereal. But it's just the idea that you can hypertext using links. Links or hypertext isn't exclusive to web pages. It just means in the data you're receiving, do you have a link to a URL that can give you more information? And so this richness is what's going to allow us to move around in different directions through Ember Data as we're accessing our application. So with all this work, this has given us a good starting point to be able to work from. And so I think we're getting close to a stopping point for today. Let's make a commit here. Say expose new models via API. And let's do that cleanup that I said a minute ago. We have this welcome page that we were using just to kind of see that the app deployed correctly. But let's remove that to keep things as a pure, just remove that scaffolding, that placeholder. This pages controller can go as well. And then I think there was a view. Yeah, pages, hello Rails. So let's delete that out. And so now we should be good. Remove the root route. All right, sweet. Well, let's see if there's anything else that we can do. Do I want to add in that database for constraint to make those fields required? I don't really think so. Let's just browse through and see if anything else comes to mind when it comes to our data here. Are there any other validations we would like to add? We have seen, I think we may have seen before in Postman how you can create records, so we could look at that again sometime. But yeah, let's see. In the database, we have our schema. Author has a name, idea has a summary, quotes has a source, an idea, and then a text. Note that all these tables have a created at and updated at field. That's something Rails gives us by default unless we ask for it not to do that. And that ends up being useful to just keep track of changes. That's something that you often find that you want to add later when you want to record the state of something. So that's nice that adds that out of the blue. We've got these IDs. The IDs are connected together just by convention. As a reminder, we have a users table, but we haven't hooked up anything to permission it by user. Once we get into authentication and authorization in the future, we'll tie all these records so that they are specific to a user, so they don't have to be shared. And then we have our foreign keys here. Yeah, that looks good. Let's browse through our models to see. Validates name, validates summary. We can make sure that the URL is a URL. That's probably a good idea. Let's do that. Was that on the... It was the source. And we'll just see, no, yeah, source URL. Let's see if Rails has a built-in URL validation. If not, we won't worry about it. Validation helpers. No, there's not a built-in one. Well, I'm sure it wouldn't be too hard to add, but I don't want to worry about that right now. I think we're probably fine. Okay, so with this, I'm going to push this up as a branch so that y'all can take a look if you want. Take a look at the state of this code. Just to talk at a bit of a high level here. So if you're used to working in a NoSQL database, this may feel like a lot of overkill. You may feel like, hey, like if I'm working with Firebase or MongoDB, I just store a document and I just store a data structure, JSON-like data structure of objects and arrays and fields and primitives. And it's easy, I'm good to go. Like it's nested, it's rich. I don't need to have multiple separate files for each thing I want to store. What is the benefit of all this complexity that we've added in? And there's a few reasons for that. One thing is that Jace, and I'm sure folks that have worked more extensively with both relational and non-relational databases can speak to it better than I can, but I can speak to it a little bit. So when you have a tree of data, that's really useful for when you're viewing that tree from one perspective, but if you want to reshuffle the data around in a different way, it can be hard to do so. It can be a lot of manual work. Whereas with a relational database, it defines these different tables that have multiple, like bidirectional associations. So whichever way you want to query it, whichever way you want to stitch it together, you can get access to the data the way you want it. And so it's kind of multi-directional. The other thing about relational databases traditionally is that they have a lot of guarantees in place as far as data consistency. You won't end up in a situation where data has been deleted, but it's not consistent. That's part of the deal with these foreign keys. We want to make sure that every quote has an idea that it's connected to, and you never have a quote that's been inserted, but the corresponding idea has not been inserted. So it keeps your data consistent and can result in being less likely to drop data. Now, NoSQL databases have strengths as well, and they could be a good fit depending on the project. But this is some of the benefits of relational databases, and there's many more as well. So I was fortunate enough to kind of come up through computer science in a time where relational databases was kind of effectively all there was, and so I learned those, and it's been really useful. But I advocate it for you if you haven't checked out relational databases, SQL databases. They can be very useful, and some folks would argue essential. So you won't, as many new trends are coming around in web development, and as big as NoSQL databases are, relational SQL databases aren't going away. And so if you haven't learned about them, I'd highly recommend it. I think you'll be benefited as a result of doing so. As a reminder, Postgres is the name of the database that Rails tends to prefer by default, at least the Rails community. And so you can check it out. It's easy to install. There's another option. The actual default for Rails when you create a new one is called SQLite. It's sort of a single user SQL database that runs just kind of locally in a file. It's nice and simple to use. And so SQLite can be a great way to get started. I mean, it just works out of the box when you create a new Rails application. So you can give it a try as well. And again, if I find some resources on learning SQL, I'll share them and I'll let you know. Well, that's it for today. We built out the data layer in kind of a rich way, and it's interesting. You'll notice that so far in the stream, we've kind of alternated back and forth between back-end development and front-end development. So it's certainly not the case that you can just bang out the front end and the back end like instantaneously in 10 minutes. It might be a little faster if I wasn't explaining through everything, but it's like, yeah, I mean, there's complexity here. Like this is kind of a rich system that has a lot happening in the browser and a lot happening on the back end as well. But all things considered, we were able to add things pretty straightforwardly. We didn't have to write any SQL queries. We didn't have to remember foreign key and index syntax in databases, which I've never learned in SQL. I've always used an ORM for that. We didn't have to write custom controllers or custom validation logic, and this is just some of the many benefits that Rails provides to us to be able to have all those things hidden behind abstractions, so that in the common cases, like right now where we're creating an information system, we can do it quickly and effectively without having to do all of that by hand or risk having a fragile system where none of that is enforced for us. So I really like it. Check out Rails for your API if you haven't done so before. I think you'll be glad you did. And thanks for joining in. So I'm Josh Justice once again, Coding It Wrong on Twitter. On the Ember Discord, which you can find the links to in the show notes, I'm on there, so you can say hello to me on there. I'm Josh Justice on Discord. Say hi there and let me know your experience with Ember and with Rails, any questions you have. And next time, we're going to start taking all this complex data and figure out how to lay out on the screen. I haven't decided exactly how, other than those two different use cases I described, which was two different ways to use it. We might actually kind of write things out in terms of use cases next time. So thanks for joining in. I appreciate it. We'll talk to you online, and we'll catch you next time. Thanks a lot. See ya. Let's go to the slide.